Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. As you might have already noticed, I'm still suffering from a bit of a flu bug, but I'm going to continue this morning as best I can, and I beg the indulgence of my listeners. And we'll continue now with our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. We're going to begin chapter 15 this morning, but before we do, I want to read the last few sentences of chapter 14, a very poignant warning for us today from R.W. Thompson. Speaking of the papacy and those in support of the papacy, he says, "But when they impudently arraign whole nations of people, deny to them the right to govern their own affairs, pronounce judgment against them as heretics and traitors to God, and claim that the Pope has the divine right to set his own rules over them, it is quite time for us to understand what is to be the effect of all of this upon the future destiny of our own country." Poignant indeed. The whole exercise of reading this book on Inquisition Update is to assess the papal threat to this country. And R.W. Thompson continues, he says, "But this question can be more satisfactorily considered when we shall have learned something more of the working of the papal system, which we are now asked to adopt in preference to that which has placed us in so eminent a position among the nations." Now, this is an indirect reference to the Papacy's encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864, which was the primary concern of R.W. Thompson at the time of the writing of this book. That the papacy, in that encyclical and syllabus, enumerated all of the anathemas that the papacy placed upon our form of government and upon the liberties embodied in our Bill of Rights, and simply suggested that he was the God of this world, and he was the King of kings and Lord of lords, and he wished to bring this nation and all the other nations that had rebelled against his authority back under his authority, which demands a complete reconstruction of our Constitution, or an elimination of it altogether, and the replacement of our bottom-up form of government to one that is hierarchical, in other words, dictatorial and tyrannical. And if we see, if my listeners see that our government has become more dictatorial and top-down in contradistinction to its original form, then we have good reason, ample reason to suspect that the papacy, little by little, through Roman Catholics in government, have overturned our government without informing the people. Now, R.W. Thompson says, in order to understand how this has affected our country today, we need to learn more about the history of England and other nations where the papacy has done likewise. Now, chapter 15, we're going to continue our study of the history of England. This is a very good study to use in the prediction of how the papacy might manipulate in order to control our government. This is chapter 15. We're going to outline the chapter through the typical brief preludes that R.W. Thompson gives in the book. First, the Pope turns England over to France. Okay, he's going to completely do away with the English government and hand it over to France. This is one nation, excuse me, pardon me as I struggle with my ailment here. The Pope turns England over to France, literally turning England over to France. This is a conquest. It's what this is. Papal conquest. England was in rebellion against the Pope, so the Pope used another nation to conquer England. He's going to talk about the resistance of the barons. The barons of England threw up a resistance to this. He's going to talk about John resigns the crown to the Pope. That was John, the King of England, resigns his crown to the Pope. We're going to talk about a Roman Catholic prelate by the name of Langton, which we've already mentioned. The charter of Henry I. The barons form a league. Langton supports the barons, which results in the Magna Carta, and John swears to obey it. The Pope releases him and annuls the charter. He claims England, excuse me, he claims England as a fief, F-E-I-F, in other words, a slave to the papacy. Foreign mercenaries, that's right, the papacy used foreign mercenaries to overthrow England, and the papacy has done this in the past. Anytime he can use a foreign group of mercenaries to accomplish an end, he knows that those mercenaries have no love for the country that they're in, and they're motivated by money, greed, avarice, and to take part of the booty, if not their wages. Now, we've seen those who are paying attention knows that the Pope uses UN forces to go in to do their jobs. Now, these are foreign mercenaries. The papacy resorts to foreigners to accomplish his conquest when no other means is available. We're going to talk about Henry III, the Italian and foreign priests. That's right, the Pope used Italian and other foreign priests to replace the domestic Roman Catholic priests of England who were loyal to their country. Okay, the king promises to observe the charter. The Pope again releases him from his obligation to observe the Magna Carta. Appeals to Rome, Peter Pence, immunities of the clergy. And this is one of the most outrageous aspects of all of this, that the priests of Rome conducted murders within England as though they were little gods, and they were not held to account. And you'll find this to still be the case today, and it's nowhere more obvious than in the case of the pedophile priest pandemic in the world. These priests go scot-free. All right, they murder with impunity. Speaking of the murders of these immune Roman Catholic clergy, we're going to speak about the House of Commons established. That's an attempt to put the commoners, the people who had been so brutalized by these wars between the King of England and the Pope, the people were caught in the middle. And they were not considered in any of the moves, either of the Pope or the King. And they were the ones who suffered the brunt of the abuse taking place from both. So they established a House of Commons where the common people had a direct influence in the government. Now the Pope again releases the king from his oath, which led to civil war. And the barons were defeated. The treatment of the king and the Pope. Edward I confirms the charter. The Pope releases him. Edward II, we're going to discuss Edward II, the Statute of Provisors and of Praemunire, the Lollards, the law for burning heretics, William Sauter and Thomas Badby burned, the Lollards attacked, clergy exempt from punishment in secular courts. There's the immunity again. See, this all keeps coming up over and over and over again. Their corruption and that of the popes. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So absolute corruption will be demonstrated by both the popes and his priests, Urban V and Gregory XI, popes and anti-popes. That's right, the papacy was in turmoil again. There was more than two popes ruling at the same time. Scandalous and disgraceful conduct. Gregory VII, Pope at Rome, and Benedict the 13th at Avignon, France, both declared infamous by the Council of Pisa. Alexander V, John the 23rd, deposed for enormous crimes by the Council of Constance. Martin V, influence upon the church, corruption almost universal, the fruits of the false decretals. So, I know much of this sounds a little bit disjointed and probably confusing to those who are not familiar with English history, and I confess to my listeners that English history is still a struggle for me. But we can look forward to gaining tremendous insight by studying the history of England and its wars and wars of the popes and the rebellion of the people, and it sheds great light in our understanding of what goes on in the world today. People of the world today cannot understand what is happening right before their eyes without understanding history, because everything that happens today happens in the context of history. See, we're led to believe that somehow these things that we're talking about now are disconnected from reality, that they were so far in the distant past that they have no consequence for us today. But the truth of the matter is, they are of so much consequence that if we fail to understand this, we fail to understand that nothing has changed. The Pope is still trying to conquer the world for his ultimate sovereign and supreme rule, and he uses the kings of the earth and pits the people against the kings and the kings against the people, and uses that dialectic. And each stroke of the opposition, one against the other, the Pope advances his agenda. Nothing can be accomplished by the papacy in the context of his, if for no other better reason, no better description, his prophetic role in the world. It cannot be accomplished without conflict. Conflict is the basis upon which the Pope moves the world in his direction. So this is why the Scripture talks about wars, and rumors of wars, because the wars, the conflicts, are the means and the methods by which the Pope advances his earthly kingdom. All right, we'll get into the text now of chapter 15. This is page 455 if you're following along. The condition into which King John, the King of England, John, the most disgraced king in English history, the condition into which King John was thrown by the attempt of Innocent III to stir up an insurrection in England against his authority was embarrassing in an extreme degree. He had incurred the animosity of the Norman barons, who, after having at first entertained hostility toward the native Britons and the Saxons, had become reconciled to both and were anxious to defend and share with them their ancient rights and privileges. Remember, the Angles, or the ancient Brits, were evangelized by the Apostle Paul. They had the true gospel. And knowing that Christ was the King of kings and Lord of lords, and that he dwelt within every man who accepted him as their Savior, they knew that they were the temple of the living God, and that righteousness dwelled within them, and they chose to obey Christ as their King, and to maintain the liberty with which Christ had made them free. The Saxons, on the other hand, who were of the Teutonic race, had a tradition, an ancient tradition, that the people picked their kings and held their kings to account to the people to maintain their liberties. These two groups of people melded together in England to form what is known today as the Anglo-Saxons, and they are the greatest warriors for peace. Now, the popes, seeing that these people could not easily be enslaved, used foreigners as the governors, or at first an attempt to corrupt the Saxon kings and tell them that their right to rule did not come from the people who elected them, as in the ancient Saxon tradition, but that they ruled by divine right. They ruled at the behest of God, and they enjoyed that rulership through the Pope. Okay, their power ultimately came from the Pope and not from the people. So being proud and arrogant, and to secure their thrones, they sided with the Pope against the people. Now, that wasn't working out well either, so the Pope used the Normans, okay, more related to the Italian race, who would be most submitted to the Pope, and he used those to overthrow and to dictate and to rule the people. So this is what R.W. Thompson here is talking about. He had incurred the animosity of the Norman barons, who, after having at first entertained hostility toward the native Britons and Saxons, had become reconciled to both and were anxious to defend and share with them their ancient rights and privileges. So now we have the barons, even the Normans, were appreciative now of the beliefs and practices of the Saxons and the Britons, the ancient Britons. They wanted to preserve their freedom. So this puts the barons, the Saxons, and the Britons against the king and the Pope. Now, these barons were Roman Catholics in all the essentials of the Roman faith, but as they found nothing in that faith when uncontaminated by the influence of the papacy, requiring them to submit passively to the tyranny of either kings or popes, they became early impressed with the necessity of adopting such measures as would teach their rulers that the English people had some rights that they were bound to respect. Okay? You can about imagine that the king's not going to like this, and neither is the Pope. So we have a natural alliance and allegiance being formed now between the king and the Pope. Now, the occasion afforded them the opportunity of seeking to avenge themselves of the king for the injuries he had inflicted upon them in the previous part of his reign. And as the power of the crown, when backed by that of the papacy, was too strong for resistance by any ordinary means, they began to combine with a view to his expulsion from the throne and the election of another king more favorable to the people. So the people, together with the barons, decided, we're tired of the Pope ruling this country through our king. So we're going to boot him off the throne and put somebody in there that's more sensitive to our needs and our rights and our liberties. So we've got a rebellion taking place in England. It says the Pope, taking advantage of this disaffection, the Pope is going to use this dynamic and use it for his own benefit. Listen to what happens here. The Pope, taking advantage of this disaffection, and supposing that there existed no further impediment to the consummation of his plans, issued another bull deposing John and empowering the King of France to put the sentence into the execution. So the Pope sees the pressure building amongst the people, so rather than fight the people, he just lets the people have their way, but he uses the Franks, France to accomplish it, a nation that is loyal to the papacy. So see the duplicity here. Okay, of course, the King of France, faithful as he was to the Roman Catholic Church, did not act altogether out of religious motives, nor did the Pope, although he claimed to be employing a divine power only for the good of the Church, and he addressed himself to... let me read this over. Of course, the King of France, faithful as he was to the Church, did not act altogether out of religious motives, nor did the Pope, although he claimed to be employing a divine power only for the good of the Church, address himself to any such motive. The pretext of the good of the Church was, on the part of both, the mere cover for ambition of the baser sort. So here we have the use of religion, once again, as a cloak, a disguise under which ambitions can be exercised by mere mortal men, greedy, money-grubbing, power-grubbing. So the church forms the cover. The good of the church forms the cover for these machinations. And it says, therefore we find the Pope promising the French king, as a reward for his aggressive interference with the affairs of England, quote, listen to this, the remission of all sins, together with the crown of England, when once he had dethroned the tyrant, unquote. So the Pope is going to use his heavenly authority by just remitting all the sins of the French. Just, your sins are forgiven thee. This is blasphemy. And it says, together with the crown of England. This is simony. This is the use of money to gain ecclesiastical favor, promising a gift. Now, it was scarcely possible to make a more bountiful bestowal of pontifical favor. In one breath, the sins of a whole lifetime were forgiven, and in the next, the crown of a nation was given away. Does the Pope have the power to give away whole nations and crowns of those nations? This is a usurpation. God did not endue the Pope with any such power. The papacy is not a servant of Christ. He is Antichrist. Now, the Pope had about as much right to do one as the other. The first was an assumption of a prerogative which belongs to God alone, that of forgiving sins, right? And it says the second was a criminal violation of the law of nations. So the Pope is a two-time loser here, according to the judgment of God. Now, both acts, under the pretense of divine sanction, were impious. But the King of France readily accepted the proposition and commenced military preparations to carry it into execution. So you can see the French king, well, I'm on the side of the Pope, and I'm going to get possession of England, and I'm going to make myself rich and powerful and bind up my ties with the Pope, and I'm going to be in like Flynn, right? Using the arrogance and pride of a mere greedy man just like himself to take over England. And that is typical papacy all throughout history, to use the sinful nature of man to accomplish his ends, because he himself has a sin nature, a nature that comes from Satan himself. The Pope raises nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. The Pope instigates wars, more wars, and the threat of war to advance his purpose in the world, that is, global conquest. And in this case, he's using the King of France to overthrow the kingdom of England, a Catholic nation against a nation struggling to become Protestant, if you want to view it that way. The Protestant Reformation is hundreds of years yet in the future, but still, these people love liberty. They've been evangelized by the Apostle Paul, and Paul's influence is still the hope of the people of England, and the Pope won't have it. So now he's using France to overthrow the Kingdom of England, and here's how he does it. Here's how the Pope accomplishes wars, and the threat of war, by offering the kings of the earth that he chooses plenary indulgence for their sins. Blasphemy. For no man can forgive sins but God only. And then he uses bribery through the taking advantage of the natural sinful tendencies of man to greed and avarice. Simply promises to award the King of France the crown of England. And all of this takes effect the moment that he takes the English king off his throne. Now, but the King of France readily accepted the proposition and commenced military preparations to carry it into execution. So we have the threat of war. And the Pope, however, was too cunning a politician to permit measures to be carried to extremes, so long as there was a possibility of accomplishing his ends by other means. For he was sagacious enough to see that with Philip of France in possession of the English throne, he might have an adversary far more formidable than John to deal with. So you comprehending this? All the while, the Pope is promising plenary indulgences to the King of France, promising him the crown. He's also setting up countermeasures to make sure that he doesn't accidentally create an uncontrollable monster in opposition to the papacy in the process. You see how he's hedging his bets here? The papacy is a master manipulator. He's got a double motive here. He wants England under his sole authority, and he wants to use France to do it, but he doesn't want to create in France a monster that he can't control, being a combination of France and England. If that should ever turn against the papacy would be a sure loser. So the Pope's hedging his bets here. Now it says, accordingly, he, that is the Pope, sent a legate to John to excite his fears by telling him that the barons would take the side of Philip and to remind him of his unpopularity with the people. He hoped to bring John to terms without complying with his promise to Philip, for like many other popes, he always interpreted the law of God as if it had been made flexible and yielding merely for the purpose of advancing the papal ambition. As the courage of John had already begun to fail, the legate had little difficulty in impressing his mind with the views of the Pope, who, notwithstanding the anathema of the church rested upon John's head, was still willing to treat with an excommunicated heretic, if thereby he could add to the power of the papacy. See, so the Pope's not pristine. He'll negotiate with an excommunicated heretic. Remember, the Pope condemned the King John, excommunicated him from the church, reduced him to a groveling, sniveling heretic to be burned. But now the Pope's negotiating with him, hoping to stave off this war of France, with the consideration that if he can get John to concede to all of his demands, France won't be necessary, and the Pope will rule over both France and England with no threat of France and England uniting against the Pope. All right. When this legate, therefore, found that John had become alarmed at the formidable alliance against him, he developed the whole papal plan by telling him that his only remedy was to put him wholly under the protection of the Pope, which he could do by becoming a dutiful son of the Church and by promising to perform whatsoever the Pope should enjoin upon him. John, caught in the papal net, finally consented to these humiliating terms and agreed to take the necessary oath. What does the Bible say about taking oaths? Let your yeas be yeas and your nays be nays, and anything further than that cometh of evil, doesn't it? So here the man of sin is going to require an oath to be taken of John. Now, however, when the legate came to explain the terms of the surrender, he insisted that as John's offenses were, quote, against God and the church, unquote, as all offenses against the papacy are yet regarded by the advocates of infallibility, he must also resign the crown into the Pope's hands. Forced by the seeming necessity of his condition, and with his spirit crushed by the violence of pontifical wrath, John consented even to this, and publicly taking the crown from his head, laid it at the feet of the legate. He literally laid his crown at the feet of Antichrist. He then signed a charter, resigning to the Pope the kingdom of England and the lordship of Ireland. And thus the King of England became a vassal of the Pope of Rome, promising to pay 1,000 marks a year in money and binding all of his successors to like obedience. And you better believe that when the Pope drags out his secret weapons against England, this is it, that John capitulated and that John consigned all of his successors to be vassals of the papacy. This is the claim that the papacy has over Protestant England today. Now, all of this was done without any regard whatsoever to the interest or the wishes of the people, who under the impious pretense that God required it, were transformed from one despot to another like cattle sold in the public market. And thus Pope Innocent III, by virtue of authority derived from the forged decretals, remember the whole papal power, the whole papal pretension, the whole office of the papacy stands on these false decretals, forgeries, man-made fakes, universally accepted. Nobody debates this anymore. Nobody can defend those false decretals, but the papacy still insists that they form the basis of his authority on the earth. And the kings of the earth submit. Why? Because the Pope, under the pretense of being the vicar of Christ on earth, can raise up nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and can literally bring any king to heel if he so chooses. He says, and thus Pope Innocent III, by virtue of authority derived from the forged decretals, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, planted his feet upon the necks of the English people. Even Lingard, remember he was a papal legate, even Lingard, conscious of the iniquity of the act, cannot refrain from saying that, quote, this transaction has heaped everlasting infamy on the memory of John, unquote, and he might with equal propriety and justice have added like infamy upon the memory of Innocent III, who planned, plotted, and contrived it by fraud, usurpation, and deceit, all covered up under the flimsy disguise of infallibility. And yet, infamous as it was, it is not at all too strong to say that Pope Pius IX would avail himself of the same disguise today or tomorrow to do the same thing in England or the United States or any other country under like favorable circumstances. So, again, R.W. Thompson is telling us, take heed what the popes did in England, because the Pope, even their successors as far as Pope Pius IX, still have these prerogatives, still have these motives, and can still raise kingdom against kingdom and nation against nation and perpetuate wars, and the threat of war upon the people of the earth. The whole purpose of which is to conquer the world eventually and to seat himself as King of Kings and Lord of Lords without opposition. Now, John, having thus traded away the crown of England to the Pope, to the disgrace of both the seller and the buyer, The dissatisfaction against him became intense throughout the kingdom. Langton, who, though the Pope's legate, now get this, Langton, though the Pope's legate, sympathized with the barons, and in order to stimulate their zeal, he made known to them the existence of an old charter granted by Henry I, a fact which was of the utmost importance to their cause, but of which they were previously ignorant. Thus notified of this important grant, the barons were easily induced to enter into a league or confederacy to secure the greater degree of independence upon the basis of the old Saxon liberties. Okay, so we're digging out deep down in the drawer, and we find this charter granting liberties to these Saxon people. And this Roman Catholic legate, Langton, has become sympathetic to the people and has offered them a defense, this old charter. And it says, when this movement was made known to the Pope, he was gratified, not because he desired or intended that the barons should obtain any additional liberties, but because he'd hoped that the breach between them and the king would become so irreconcilable that they could not unite against him. For he understood perfectly well that if the king and the barons were united in opposition against him, they could soon terminate all his usurped authority in England. The Pope again hedging his bets. Now, but Langton understood the policy and the schemings of the crafty Pope and was determined that his countrymen should not be deprived of their ancient Saxon liberties, since they were preparing to make such noble efforts for their restoration. He was familiar enough with the papacy to foresee the degradation into which they would be plunged if the Pope should secure his triumph, and he accordingly brought himself under the suspicion of the Pope, who sent another legate to England and demanded a second resignation of the crown by John and an additional treaty sealed with gold instead of wax. When this demand was made, the king, already humiliated to an unparalleled degree, consented to it. But Langton protested against it, because it was apparent that the king had by this time resolved to oppose the cause of the barons, and had promised to protect John against their demand for their ancient liberties. Langton's protestations greatly incensed the Pope, who could not understand how a papal legate could espouse the cause of English liberty. But he was afraid to proceed immediately to extremities for fear of open resistance by the people, who were now beginning to turn something of the rights out of which they had been cheated by treacherous rulers under the dictation of equally treacherous popes. See, the Pope truly fears the people, because the people, if they are possessed of the truth that Christ is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the people are unconquerable. All right, the barons were not appeased by the conduct of either the king or the Pope, but renewed their league and courageously resolved to demand the reestablishment of the charter of Henry I. When they made this demand of the king, he, backed by the Pope, refused it. Okay, the people went to seeking liberty under this charter, and the Pope and the king refused it. They don't want liberty. They want the people enslaved. Now, they then took up arms, acquired possession of London, and besieged the king in the Tower. Were they justified in this? Excuse me. Were they justified in this? Undoubtedly they were. There are two kinds of government, one of law, the other of force. When the latter, force, seizes upon and destroys the natural and inalienable liberties of a people, They have the right to reassert them by whatsoever degree of force may be necessary to resist the usurpation. In that condition, the English people were then placed. Their former freedom had been guaranteed to them by all the proper forms of law. And when kings and popes, by unrighteous combinations, had disregarded the law and set it aside, they were justified in resuming their position of independence, even at the sword's point. And the barons showed themselves capable of performing this great work, for they soon compelled the king to sign 2 charters, one of which was the Charter of Liberties, or the Magna Carta, which is yet regarded as the foundation of the present liberties of England and the United States. Being, Being afraid to trust the king, the barons required him to take an oath to observe these charters, which he did in the most solemn form. But circumstances soon transpired to show that, notwithstanding the solemnity with which his oath had been taken, he did not intend to be bound by it. It was considered an essential part of the doctrine of the divine right of kings that they were not bound by any promise made by them to the people, in whose hands none of the powers of government were lodged. And if this convenient method of escape from the obligation of an oath had not been provided, the dispensing power of the Pope, as God's vicegerent, was always at hand to release the representative of absolutism, the representatives of absolutism from all such obligations whenever the interest of the papacy required it. You see, the Pope can absolve a king of any oath he takes that is contrary to the current will and wisdom of the popes. So the people have to remember this, that whenever they seek liberty or the restoration of their liberties, binding their king to an oath is a waste of time. Because if the king is allied or ever becomes allied with the papacy has the power and the prerogative and the selfish will to simply declare the oath null and void, because it opposes the vicar of Christ. Okay, this kind of treachery marks all of history. No oath is binding on a king or a pope, if the pope so wills it. The people are left without any trust. They can't bind any king or any pope to any agreement. They simply have to establish their own liberty by whatever means they possibly can, ignoring all treaties with these kings and popes when they're allied. Okay? Satan doesn't play by the rules. Right? Remember, Satan is the lawless one. He can't be bound by an oath. Okay? He uses deceit and all forms of treachery to achieve his desire to rule this world. And the human agency through which Satan seeks to control the world is the papacy himself. Okay, God has his human agencies, and Satan has his. And it's not difficult to identify either one if carefully observing their actions. Okay. Now, in this particular instance, King John was stimulated to the violation of his oath by the foreigners who were about his court and who had been sent into England by the Pope to aid him in oppressing the people by the exercise of ecclesiastical authority under the canons, that is, the decrees of the popes, the false decretals, under the canons of the Roman Catholic Church, and who were assiduous in their efforts to become the masters of the country. So again, the Pope used foreigners who were sympathetic to the Pope and who had selfish means and motives of their own to impose the Pope's will. And it says, these ecclesiastics assisted the king to raise foreign troops to resist the barons, because such troops, being merely mercenaries and having no sympathies with the English people, were always ready to enlist in any cause which promised them remuneration. In other words, money, whether it be in the form of money or booty. Okay, the Pope always being the ultimate owner of the earth and everything that's in it, can offer a mercenary army both gold and booty. Okay, the earth is mine and the fullness thereof. That's the blasphemy of the Pope. Now the king, however, while employing these means of subjugating his own people, called also upon the Pope for assistance. He sent him copies of the charters he had granted the barons, in order to show how much they encroached upon the royal and pontifical authority, and asked that he be absolved from his oath to observe them. That is, that the Pope, as God's representative, should release him from the obligation to obey a promise solemnly made to his own countrymen concerning their own domestic laws and policy. The Pope was greatly incensed at the barons for having dared to assert such liberties for themselves and the people, understanding perfectly well that such a concession would lead to a demand for others. And, quote, in his rage he swore, of course by the throne of St. Peter, that cost him what it would, he would never suffer their rashness to go unpunished, unquote. He annulled the charters, absolved the king from his oath, and wrote to the barons commanding them to renounce what they had extorted from John as the only means of escaping the pontifical wrath. Lingard comes to their assistance again by furnishing us the reason which influenced Innocent III in his additional act of interference with English affairs. After naming several, such as the violation of their fealty to the king by the barons, the fact that they had presumed to sit in judgment upon the conduct of their king, and the additional fact that John had agreed to take part in the Crusades and was therefore entitled to protection, he proceeds to say, quote, lastly, England was become the fief of the Holy See, and they, that is the barons, could not be ignorant that if the king had the will, he had not at least the power to give away the rights of the crown without the consent of his feudal superior, that is, the Pope. He, the Pope, was therefore bound to annul the concessions which had been extorted from John, as having been obtained in contempt of the Holy See, to the degradation of royalty, to the disgrace of the nation, and to the impediment of the crusade, unquote. Now, could anything show more satisfactorily the nature of the divine power over the temporal affairs of nations exercised by this godless Pope Innocent III and now reasserted by Pope Pius IX? In this particular case, it went to the extent of claiming plenary jurisdiction over the entire domestic policy of the kingdom by denying to the king any power to grant additional liberties to the English people without the consent of the Pope. The Papacy has always taught, and will continue to teach that no right may be obtained unless it comes from the Pope, and that he may, having given you that right, he may remove it at any time. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, a counterfeit of the true, the Papacy, is not of Christ, he is of Antichrist, the lawless one, the son of perdition. Let it ring in the hearts of every American. I'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.